It's Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Sam Park and John Ramey with you Friday, November 10th, covering the world's biggest stories in economics and international affairs, and we will focus exclusively on the Hamas-Israel war today. I do find that this is tragic every time we talk about it, but perhaps especially so because tomorrow is Armistice Day, Veterans Day now, but originally Armistice Day that ended the fighting at the start of the 20th century, or the first quarter of it in the Great War. And it does seem like humanity is struggling to learn lessons. The United States announced yesterday that Israel will implement 4-hour humanitarian pauses in parts of the northern Gaza Strip. Israel's military says it's not a ceasefire. There was a great interview that you sent me, Sam, on MSNBC with Andrea Mitchell and former Israeli Prime Minister and former Chief of Staff to current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett. And I thought Bennett explained very clearly the Israel position behind not wanting to have extended pauses in their military campaign and why that was tactically disadvantageous. And also from a humanitarian perspective, why pauses allow Hamas in Gaza to reorganize and perhaps rearm and extend the suffering for everybody. I thought it was a riveting interview.
Yeah, it was terrific. And I found it interesting also that it was Bennett saying this.
Who is not currently in the government.
That's right. And in fact, our listeners might recall that in the very early days after October 7th, there was some talk of Israel forming a unity government, including Benjamin Netanyahu and some of the parties that had opposed him at the previous election. This did not happen. That is to say, as you mentioned, Bennett is not in the government right now, and he's someone that we might think of as being opposed to Netanyahu, since he was defeated by Netanyahu in the last election. But even he was explaining basically what the Israeli government, or at least the Israeli military's point of view is on this issue. And for example, the former defense minister, Benny Gantz, is today serving in the Wartime Unity Cabinet. And when they were speaking of forming a unity government, the idea was that Netanyahu would have to abandon his hard right coalition partners. And so there are many commentators who've been saying that Netanyahu is essentially finished after the war. I'm not so sure that's true. Netanyahu's political obituary has been written many times by many people, and they've been wrong every time. And so I think this episode of the mooted unity government might be instructive anyway, because at what would have seemed to have been a period of perhaps maximum political vulnerability for Netanyahu, he was able to keep his far-right coalition partners inside the government. And it was his erstwhile political opponents who were forced to concede, or perhaps not forced, but did concede. Benny Gantz agreed to serve in the wartime cabinet, even with the hard right elements of Netanyahu's government remaining in place. And I think this is also instructive in that many people, and it seems an overwhelming majority of Israelis, are opposed to Netanyahu. They would prefer that he no longer be the head of the government. But at the same time, they are very broadly supportive of the war and the way it's being fought. So people like myself, for example, who are generally not well disposed towards Netanyahu, let's say, shouldn't misjudge what's actually happening in Israel. They may not like Netanyahu, but They're very broadly supportive of the war and how it's being fought. Therefore, take the names out again, right? If you're the unpopular prime minister of Israel, and the war is more popular than you are, you have a strong incentive to wrap yourself around the war. And I think we can perhaps speculate that Netanyahu's political fortunes will rise and fall with how the war is executed and how successful it's judged to be by the Israeli public.
I have a meta question for you before I proceed. Is it unfair or inhumane even to talk about Netanyahu's most recent government and increasingly hardline right-wing settlement kind of manifest destiny in occupied territory and how that was politically unpopular in Israel and simultaneously always or consistently fueling the fire for what we now know was a burgeoning Hamas violent act?
I don't think it's unfair, but that's mainly because there's an additional element to that you did not mention in that brief overview, which is that, and it's difficult to disentangle all these things and perhaps impossible, but there's a narrative anyway inside of Israeli society that because Netanyahu was so beholden to his hard right coalition partners that he botched the security equation vis-a-vis the Palestinians. That is, the main goal of the hard right elements of Netanyahu's government is, or maybe not the main goal, but one of their goals is to expand settlements inside the West Bank, not Gaza, right, but the West Bank. And this has been happening very intensively.
And there have been years of liberal Israelis opposing this.
That's right. And so earlier this year, when we discussed the protests that had arisen inside Israel against Netanyahu's government, they were against the proposed judicial reforms, which have gone ahead. And the idea was that there was a sort of bargain between Netanyahu and his coalition partners on the hard right, in which Netanyahu wanted the judicial reforms in order to escape the criminal indictments under which he's laboring. Whereas
for corruption.
That's right. Whereas his coalition partners wanted the judicial reforms because the judiciary in Israel is one of the few institutions inside the country that ever stands in the way of settlement expansion in the West Bank.
It is not terribly dissimilar in, for example, when Andrew Jackson wanted to displace the Cherokee, and the United States Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Now,
That's
Jackson ignored that ruling, but essentially that was what was happening in Israel. The independent judiciary was saying, no, you cannot just settle the West Bank.
Well, I mean,
or there were at least legal impediments, and certain actions were declared illegal.
That's right. Certain settlements, that
It effectively slowed.
That's right.
This kind of hard right. I'm using the term manifest destiny because that's the thing that's most familiar to me.
Right.
When they talk about going to the river.
That's right. They were one of the only impediments in that process. Now, I don't think they were enough of an impediment, by the way, because a settlement expansion
still happening, right?
Has been going on and this is one of, I would say, the main obstacles to a future Palestinian state, in which increasing amounts of land are just being hived off of the West Bank every day, literally every day. And even since October 7th, there have been, just as there were before October 7th, bands of settlers, sometimes in the company of Israeli police and military, just, shooting Palestinians inside the West Bank and forcing them off their land right now. And so I don't think it's an unfair comparison at all, right? And I think I said this in our first episode right after October 7th, which was, almost a week later that we were first able to cover this. But if we can't talk about the Hamas attacks of October 7th as atrocities, we're not having a serious conversation. And if we can't talk about the 16-year blockade of Gaza and the always increasing settlement activity in the West Bank, we're also not having a serious conversation.
Yeah, this is an example where you can condemn terrorism and you can condemn Hamas, but you can also criticize and even condemn certain Israeli policies.
That's right. I feel like we have to do both.
Right. And again, because we're American, or at least for me, I keep coming back to the 19th century and the United States expansion into native territory and the legal ramifications, right? When you talk about bands of settlers in the occupied West Bank territory, kind of forming up with Israeli military and rather violently seizing swaths of land, well, that sounds like Texas.
Okay, sure, but I think that
Texas before it was annexed by the United States.
Okay,
right?
fine. The problem I have with that construction is that the scale is just so much smaller in the case of Israel.
Right.
There's a lot less land, and so the idea in the United States was that there's always someplace else
to shove the native peoples.
Yeah,
right.
And that's just not true.
Fair enough.
In this case, and so there's an analogy that we can employ. But I think the efficacy of that analogy is extraordinarily limited, again, just by the scale of the phenomena in question.
Maybe it is instructive to me just by allowing a pause in kind of an instinctive attempt to find a moral high ground.
Yeah, I guess I understand that. But the fact is, we know how that process worked out. Right. And we should hope for a better outcome, I think, certainly, in this particular case.
Another point that I will come back to the Native American example in the 19th century. There has never been the charismatic, transcendent leader of the Native American people to the extent that there was a Gandhi, right? Or to the extent that there was a Martin Luther King Jr.
Both of whom were assassinated, by the way.
Of course. Our friend Grant pointed out that the Palestinians have been almost downright unlucky, or certainly unfortunate, and that there has never been a leader of their movement, of their people, who has been the transcendent leader who can appeal to kind of international humanism. And you just wonder, right, if only there had been a Gandhi for the Palestinians. Now, I understand it's cultural differences and a ton of factors, but right now you have at least one narrative that is Hamas in Gaza are complete butchers, terrorists, terrible people, and they're hiding behind the civilian population, and there's nothing that can be done if you want to live in peace and you're an Israeli. And that is a difficult position to argue against.
I think that's right. And I think that here in the United States, it's difficult for us as Americans to understand the position that Israelis feel that they're in.
I would just add to this. It would be like if the 9/11 attackers had come from Nova Scotia.
Okay, look, can we please stop talking about the United States? Okay, there's again, there are
Sam, all I would say is perhaps I'm just so provincial, it helps inform how I might feel.
Okay, right? Fine. But perhaps you should just try to stop being quite so provincial, right? And maybe you won't succeed, right? But that doesn't mean that the effort isn't worthwhile.
Well, or maybe I'm trying to explain to our listeners who maybe aren't as geographically in tune with the region.
I understand that, but I think it would help everybody to try and understand where both sides are actually coming from, instead of trying to find some analog in our own experience can help us understand this, right? And I think as Americans, by the way, as time goes on, we're going to have to stop looking at the entire world through the lens of our own country, because we're not going to be as influential a country going forward as we have been during our lives thus far. And that's just something we're going to need to get used to. And so I think we're going to help our listeners more if we can sort of nudge them towards that idea. In Israel, and in fact, as not disposed as I generally am towards agreeing with anything that Benjamin Netanyahu says, he did say this in his interview with David Muir, I believe, on ABC earlier this week, that the entire point of the nation of Israel is that without a nation, the Jews have always been vulnerable to persecution, if not outright annihilation.
This is a historic fact.
Yeah. And so, I can't disagree with him about this. And so by establishing the nation of Israel, the Jews of the world were able to provide themselves with a location and the tools of nationhood by which they could secure their own safety in the world. And the attacks of October 7th, which we've heard over and over again, the single largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, right, seemed to blow that whole conception of Israel's own national identity out of the water, or at least seemed to put it at grave risk. And this is very difficult to come to grips with, I think, if you're an Israeli citizen. And I think it helps explain why they can be simultaneously opposed to their own government and very deeply supportive of the war. And again, we don't have an event in our country, in our memory anyway, that has any resemblance to that idea in our country as October 7th has in Israel. I would also point out that what's happening in Gaza right now is something that Americans can't possibly begin to understand in the lens of our own national historical experience. If you're a Palestinian in Gaza right now, you're going through something that Americans cannot have any comprehension of. And we should understand the limits of our own ability to grasp something like this, which, by the way, we're going to find out more about as time goes on. Because, yeah, we've seen a lot of reporting from Gaza, a surprising amount to me, but journalists still, by and large, haven't been allowed into Gaza in large numbers. We're going to see a lot more about the suffering inside of Gaza in the coming months, and it's going to be horrifying.
One thing in the Andrea Mitchell interview that former Prime Minister Bennett spoke about was essentially a demilitarized buffer around Gaza after, in some end scenario, after the military campaigns have ended. And it would effectively reduce the area of the Palestinian territory within Gaza. And he said, look, that's the price you pay for these attacks. There will be a demilitarized zone. Is that going to be remotely palatable to the international community?
Difficult to say. I mean, the international community has generally proved to be rather ineffective in being able to have any influence on what Israeli security policy is in relation to the Palestinians. And so I don't know. The Palestinians themselves will almost certainly see it as an additional land grab.
Sure.
Which I think would be difficult, although not impossible to argue with. One thing I would say, though, is that, for instance, the attacks of October 7th took place generally right around the border of Gaza, right? Are Israelis really going to want to move back to those areas? And if not, why not just make that area the security buffer? If you need the security buffer, why can't you just use your own land to do it? And so, as illuminating as that interview was, I have to differ with Bennett on that one issue. But then again, he's Israeli and I'm not.
The other piece you sent me, which was just so fascinating, this brilliant reporting published earlier this week, published on Wednesday and updated yesterday, from Ben Hubbard and Maria Abi Habib from the New York Times. And they talked to Hamas officials. And one of the fascinating narratives contained within this article that we highly recommend, and we will publish links to both the Bennett interview and this piece, was the tension within Hamas, which became the de facto government of the Gaza Strip after about, 2007 or so, after eliminating kind of other factions, which I should point out is after the last election, right? Hamas won the election and then still had to beat back violently other factions. But there was a tension within Hamas as to whether Hamas was supposed to be a military organization forever on the mission to annihilate Israel, or whether they were supposed to govern on behalf of their people and potentially improve their lives, especially facing the blockade of Gaza, which happened when Israel pulled out and then wanted to weaken Hamas. Another thing in that article that I found fascinating was that Egypt collaborated with Israel on that blockade. I was unaware of that.
Yes. Oh, really? Yeah, that's been a big problem ever since the blockade was instituted. I would take issue, though, and this has been very well documented throughout the Israeli media by outlets that are generally friendly to the government, as well as those who are unfriendly to the government, is that Netanyahu's government has been very broadly supportive of Hamas up until this time, right? Because they wanted
but not in good faith.
Well, no. I mean,
correct me if I'm wrong, the Netanyahu government found Hamas to be kind of a useful tool in delegitimizing statehood claims for the Palestinians because they were so violent and so terroristic. And you had the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which was much less rogue, right?
Yes, they have generally they were the ones who pursued peace talks all the way through
the Palestinian Authority.
That's right. And in fact, they were established by the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. And so there's been, in fact, some of those violent struggles back after the elections were between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, run by the Fatah party, right, of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And so at that point, the split between Hamas and Fatah became a geographical split. Prior to that, there was some Fatah presence inside Gaza, although it was mainly a Hamas stronghold, and there was some Hamas presence inside the West Bank, although it was mainly a Fatah stronghold. Since then, there's been almost an entire geographical divide where you have Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank. There are still, by the way, Hamas operatives in the West Bank as well, though I should point out. But the point is that that Netanyahu and his government wanted to strengthen Hamas at the expense of Fatah, or at least maintain a firm division between these two factions, so that he could credibly say, "I have no partner for peace negotiations." Right. And therefore, I will not pursue them. Of course, he never actually wanted to pursue them anyway. And this was just a way that he could uh, ensure that outcome. And just a note for our listeners, we're going to talk about Netanyahu a lot, and in some ways it's unfair to hang everything on him, except that, as we know, he is the longest serving Israeli prime minister in the nation's history, having served now longer than David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister of the nation, and justly thought of as the father of Israel, right? And so, to the extent that there's any continuity of policy of Israel towards the Palestinians, especially in this century, it's because of Netanyahu. The great bulk of his political career as prime minister, that is, has been since 2009. He only served 3 years as prime minister before that, and has been prime minister almost without interruption ever since.
And his premiership has taken place during a hard right turn in Israel, and
lately, yes,
some would say anti-democratic turn within Israel. And in fact, the scale of the protests that were going on that truly ended only because of this war started in January of this year through October 7th. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets protesting this government. Now, we should point out Israel is a democracy, and most of these people were not arrested or cracked down upon, right? This is one reason why there is a natural friendship between the United States and Israel, because they are ostensibly still a liberal democracy. And so you had hundreds of thousands of people protesting the Netanyahu government and their proposed judicial reform. So just to come back to that point where Netanyahu is unpopular and the aims of his increasingly right-wing government have become increasingly unpopular within Israel. But all of that takes a back seat now after October 7th.
Certainly. And Netanyahu himself also, when he announced a couple of weeks ago at the beginning of the ground operation, he said that he considered this to be Israel's second war of independence. So he's very deliberately wrapping himself in the clothing of Ben-Gurion.
Right. This is the state's mission.
Yes. And so as to how things are going to turn out for him and his government, we're just going to have to see. I wouldn't make any predictions. This whole situation is so volatile that, for example, to take my own medicine, right? Right after 9/11, George W. Bush's approval ratings just, skyrocketed.
I remember.
It wasn't that he'd become a different person, right? It wasn't that he suddenly became more competent, as we were going to find out, right? It's just that when something like this happens, political opinions, get shaken up very dramatically.
People rally around the flag.
Yeah, but as we know, Bush basically squandered that entire political opportunity that he had, right? And only very narrowly won the next presidential election. And by the time he was done with his second term, nobody wanted anything to do with him. So I wouldn't make any predictions as to how this is going to work out for Netanyahu. It's possible that he will survive, though, as he always has.
Some interesting other front news this week. The Defense Department gave a briefing this week. Air Force Brigadier General Pat Ryder, who's the press secretary of the Pentagon, declared 4 goals for the United States with regard to the Hamas-Israel war. Did you see this, Sam?
I did not see it.
1, protection of U.S. forces and citizens in the region. 2, flow of critical security assistance to Israel as a defense against further Hamas terrorist attacks. 3, coordination with Israelis to help secure the release of hostages, of which there are still 240 held by Hamas, including American citizens. And 4, strengthening of force posture across the region to deter any state or non-state actors from escalating the crisis beyond Gaza. Now, drones have been hitting United States forces, Syria-Iraq border.
Yes.
One of those drones was explosive laden and a dud. We could have had like a Lebanon Marine barracks situation back about 10 days after the start of this thing, late October. But it did not go off. Right now, the U.S. military has sustained, I think, 46 injuries to U.S. troops as kind of as the result of provocative attacks from other actors who want to escalate this thing. The United States has parked, I believe, the greatest deterrence in the history of war now in the region, which is an Ohio-class missile submarine, which can shoot nuclear weapons, or in this case, guided cruise missiles from underwater, like 150 of them. So you have 2 aircraft carriers and at least one that they've publicized, Ohio-class submarine in the region. So the United States deterrence posture seems to be rather strong at this point and only increasing.
That's right. I would say, I mean, the United States seems to, and I think they've not just seems to, but they've been rather explicit in saying that they really do not want this conflict to escalate outside of Gaza. And in fact, last week, just as before we came on the air, there was the speech in Lebanon by Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, the Lebanese Islamist militia, and he also basically declined to escalate. He was very broadly supportive of the attacks of October 7th, but he did not announce the broadening of the war to include Hezbollah on the northern front of Israel.
One of the fascinating things about that piece in the New York Times is how unaware Hezbollah was of these attacks and the plans for these attacks. I mean, first of all, very few people, even within Hamas, were aware of this. This was a tightly guarded situation and
operation. according to the Hamas people who spoke to the Times, right? We shouldn't necessarily be giving them credit for giving us the straight story.
Fair enough. However, the Times then independently verified this with Hezbollah people.
Yes, that's right.
So they were pretty surprised.
Again, though, I would say that,
I guess Hezbollah could lie about that. Yeah,
Hezbollah seems to have a direct interest in saying, hey, man, it wasn't us. Right. That's basically what Nasrallah said in his speech. He said it was 100% Palestinian, therefore 0% Lebanese, as we discussed at the time. And so it seems like just about everybody has interest in tamping this situation down. But for instance, if Hezbollah wants to tamp it down, I think we can assume that means that Iran also wants to tamp it down, because Hezbollah is not just operationally, but ideologically much more aligned with Iran than Hamas is, right? And so to the extent that the United States has been able to persuade Israel to moderate its military approach, which does seem to have happened.
I mean, Israel's killed 10,000 in the Gaza, but it could be worse.
Yeah, it seems as though Israel did not just, they certainly did not just roll right into Gaza, which is everybody thought was what they were going to do. They have announced these 4-hour pauses, which was definitely a concession to the pressure that the United States has been putting on them. Last week, when Secretary Blinken was in the region asking for humanitarian pauses, he was initially rebuffed by the Israelis, but it does seem that there has been some progress on that particular issue just in the past couple of days. I don't want to chain this narrative around my own neck, but it seems as though the only party that is interested in at least escalating this war is the Israelis. I could be wrong about that, right? Because they have agreed to these adjustments, apparently. But as we were saying before, many people in Israel think that Netanyahu's career will be over when the war is over. Therefore, again, take the names out. If you're the prime minister and people are saying that your career is over when the war is over,
why do you want the war to end?
Why do you want the war to end? Right. And so
and Hamas is completely happy to oblige you in that.
Yeah,
they want a forever war.
Yeah, they want the war to end. They don't want the war to end either. Right. That's the entire point, apparently. Right. And so there's a meeting of minds here. If there's pauses, then that means the war is extended, right? If you just press pause on a tape player, right, then the rest of the tape will take longer to play after you take the pause off. And so that's disquieting, right? Is that that it might have been that Netanyahu's own political interests have come into play here in terms of allowing these humanitarian.
Okay, I'm going to make a proposition for next week's episode, because I think a lot of us need to update our understanding, if any exists, of the Middle East kind of post-Cold War. And I think next week we should reflect on the still resounding silence of Saudi Arabia, and we should also talk about Iran's patronage of various groups in the area. I think that would be illuminating. I'm glad we got to talk about the Israeli political situation, and we're out of time. So I will wrap this up. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. Questions, comments, suggestions, johnrameymedia@gmail.com. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks, folks.